Hello folks, Dave Mayo here from hackyourgut.com, and today we're going to talk about intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut. Now before we start, I kind of want to discuss some of like a common myth that there's quote unquote a leaky gut syndrome. This isn't really a syndrome. You're going to have intestinal permeability every day. You're going to have intestinal permeability differently during different parts of the day, and your intestines are going to be permeable to different molecules. And again, that's going to vary between night and day, and depending on your current state, stress, sleep, and things of that nature. So what are we talking about when we talk about intestinal permeability or leaky gut? So here I got this wonderful model. Right here, I don't know if you guys know what this is. These are called number blocks. The great thing about these things, 4 months ago I had a 5-year-old son who really couldn't count up to 20, and now I have a 4-year-old son who can do most of his multiplication tables from 1 to 10, 4 times 3, 6 times 2, and all that stuff. So this is it's actually a cartoon with toys that teaches kids how to use numbers effectively. So it's pretty amazing. I mean, kind of shocked, can't count from 1 to 20, and then 4 months later you can count to 1 to 200 and multiply 6 times 3 and things of that nature. So it's also a great model for the gut. And what are the different types of intestinal permeability? There are 2 primary types of intestinal permeability that we discuss when we're talking about that. There is paracellular and there is transcellular. So what is the difference between the two? So each one of these number blocks represents an epithelial cell in the intestine. If it's in the small intestine, it's an enterocyte. If it's in the large intestine, it's a colonocyte. And so these cells are packed very, very tightly with one another. But they're not just jammed together. They have these things called tight junction proteins that actually anchor them to one another. So if we look at that, this little nub would represent the tight junction protein. And it anchors the cells to one another so that things can't leak in between the cells. When things do leak in between the cells, that is called paracellular permeability. So you may have heard of the notion of, somebody consumes gluten, it causes the release of zonulin, and you get a degradation of these tight junction proteins, and all that means is now there is space between the cell that fragments from food, bacteria, or whatever's in your gut can leak through. That's paracellular permeability. So transcellular permeability is a little different. So if you'll kind of look at these number blocks, there's different shapes here. These represent different receptors on the cell membrane. And what happens with transcellular permeability is different molecules can bind to these receptors and get carried into the cell. Now, interestingly enough, when we talk about gluten, gluten isn't really gluten when it's interacting with your epithelial cells, at least not further down the gut. What happens is our digestive enzymes, along with microbial enzymes, break down gluten into fragments called gliadin. Gliadin can bind to these receptors and get carried into the cell, and this can cause, and this is called transcellular permeability, and at the same time it can cause paracellular permeability, as you've probably heard of. But there's another way for things to get in. For example, fat-soluble things can get carried into the epithelial cells by chylomicrons, and that includes something called lipopolysaccharide, which is a highly inflammatory molecule. So if you eat a high-fat diet, you're going to absorb more of the LPS or lipopolysaccharide transcellularly into your cells. You don't need a receptor for this. It's passive because it's fat soluble, carries it right in. So generally speaking, high-fat diets, you will tend to see more lipopolysaccharide. It's going to depend on the type of fat, the different types of fatty acids. It's also going to depend on how much you eat. The more you eat, the more bacteria you're going to have. Ultimately going to end up with more lipopolysaccharide in your gut. And then there are other kind of factors that you have to take into consideration, but we don't want to get super complex with this. But what's interesting is there are different types of lipopolysaccharide, and some are beneficial, some are negative. And the nasty thing is inflammation in general in the gut is going to cause breakdown of these tight junction proteins, and it can damage these cells. And I wouldn't really, so when it damages those cells and they break up, I really wouldn't call that transcellular permeability because the cell is, you kind of have this kind of big gap, the cell's dead, things can kind of flow in through the intestinal barrier, which is obviously a very bad thing. So we have multiple things that can affect intestinal permeability. We're going to cover those. We're going to talk about things that cause intestinal permeability, and then we're going to talk about things that protect against intestinal permeability. But it's really important to understand the difference between the two. And we'll also discuss, we're probably going to be discussing lipopolysaccharide a lot in the different video series on building a healthy gut and building a healthy microbiome, because too much is bad, and when you absorb it into your bloodstream, that's bad too. But there are things we could do to make, when it does get absorbed into the bloodstream, not bad at all. And in fact, it's kind of a way that we can build up some level of resistance against that inflammatory effect. We'll talk about that all later. As of now, we got transcellular and paracellular permeability, and these are the two types of permeability we look at when we talk about intestinal permeability or leaky gut. Thank you very much. If you like this, put a comment below. Constructive criticism, comment below. If you want to see more, share it on social media, and give us a like down below here. That's the thumbs up, not the thumbs down. We don't want any of that. Cool. Thank you very much. Take care.